this is Mark. In this video I'm going to talk about the cyclic processes of life that we all experience, even though we may not be aware of all the cycles that give us the life, the emotions, the thoughts, the feelings, the intensities of life, and it ultimately gives us a fulfillment. We have, as you know, chemicals within our body, dopamine, different neurotransmitters, certain chemicals that we haven't really encountered yet. We don't know the totality of everything that exists. There's infinite expansion within the universe. We only reside in a subset of the universe. And within this subset, we have experienced, all the chemicals, or not all the chemicals, but, we experience the fragments of, life and, space and the progression of time. And the fragments, what I mean is, the elements that make up our being and the universe, it's all in union, it's all connected. And, it's just like a recipe. You put different elements together, you get an output. Well, we're getting very similar chemicals and, throughout space. It's just aligned in a certain way, programmed, and that allows us, that's why we have the uniqueness, personality. We essentially share the same feelings, the thoughts, the emotions, the chemicals, different ratios, and it's proportionate to our personality or the programming that is within us, because ultimately these cycles are going to be created based on our mind, the transience that is present within the external, the internal. And what I mean by this is, like, if you, how would I put it, if you get excited, or if you, go on a, vacation, you're going to have a euphoric effect, and then that's going to alter your internal chemistry to a degree. And normally, your body's going to go through these natural cycles. So you have waves, essentially. When you consume sugar, you get a boost. You get a boost in your well-being, which is temporary. So you're experiencing the increase toward the peak. And then if you consume too much sugar, you're going to have a higher peak and a lower dip. And then that's going to cause an energy disturbance. And ultimately, the loss of energy is going to be proportional to the magnitude or the amplitude of the wave. Normally, the body, it tries to achieve equilibrium state, and the body, based on the natural cycles of life, like the diurnal cycle, the rising of the sun, and the progression of the cycles between the day and the night, we are programmed to be, our bodies internally are connected to this cycle at an equilibrium level, but ultimately we could become disconnected if we were to reverse that, and that can create almost like an internal anxiety within the body. It can actually cause elevation, it can actually cause a temporary boost, but ultimately in the long run it's going to cause a dampening effect. So you're going to have maybe these spikes, and then again you're going to drop down low, because you're getting out of that equilibrium state. You're not following the path of least resistance, which path of least resistance is when you are connected to the natural cycle of life. For instance, when we also have hunger cycles, and the hunger, your body naturally recharges. It generates its, whether it's hydrochloric acid, the enzymes within the body to break down the food, the secretions, all that, everything that resides in the body. Once it recharges, you get the hunger. It's initiated throughout the feedback loop in the brain, and that causes you to induces that feeling, and then you go through that cycle. But normally, not everyone's going to is going to follow the natural cycle. We may not eat when we're hungry. We may eat based on our mood. If we're angry or happy or joyful or euphoric or any type of state, it can cause disturbance within these cycles. But the thing is, the transience gives us life. It gives us the freedom, the experiences. But ultimately, it's good to be cognizant and aware that there are these natural cycles that kind of guide us and kind of draw us, to reach a state of balance and equilibrium. And when we diverge from this, we can achieve imbalance. And ultimately, that can cause a cascade of problems to occur. It can lead to instability, hormone imbalances, inflammation, all other hosts of problems, just because the body is off track. And ultimately, through the law of conservation of energy, if you when you follow the path of least resistance, you're conserving it. Ultimately, if you go diverge from that, your body's going to be sapped at certain points and needs a recharge. Of course, the energy is conserved in certain space or domains, but it may be spared in other areas just to allow for that recharge in a certain domain and get you back to an equilibrium state. So naturally, even though we're not aware, our subconscious kind of guides us with these natural cycles. We may not be consciously aware, but there is a pulling, like there is a force that kind of guides us. And for instance, like when the sun goes down, naturally we have the chemical changes, and that makes us naturally tired. But we have found ways to, based on the industrialization, we don't really get out as much anymore. So we're kind of diverging from that. Being indoors all the time, not getting a lot of sunlight is affecting the circadian rhythm of life, and that can induce problems with hormones, sleep patterns, and all this, and ultimately mood, because mood is strongly connected to the sleep cycle. It's strongly connected to hormones. It's strongly, we're always going to have waves naturally. And when you're at a peak, usually generally like hormones, for instance, you get a euphoria, but when it dips, you're going to have dysphoria if it gets too low, and that can cause, irritability and all other hosts of problems. So, like I said, these natural cycles give us it's good to be aware that, all these cycles that exist. It's very interesting because, we have the rhythmic pattern, the rhythmic flow of the heart. Anytime you meditate and you focus on this, you have you have beats, or basically at a certain period, you're going to have your heart is going to beat. You have the you have the electric impulses, or the that run through your body, the neurotransmitters. It's basically like music. You have multiple beats that are basically, you don't really necessarily feel at a discrete level, but it's the whole like network that induces this effect. And ultimately, if it gets out of hand, you can actually almost feel the like a wave or like electric impulse. You have a lot of energy, and ultimately it kind of gives you, because anytime there is like a divergence, like when you experience for instance, let's say like low energy, apathy, negative mood and all that, is generally corresponding to a lack of these chemical or imbalance in the other negative direction. And in this direction, it causes, I like to think of it as singularity. Think of like singularity of a point in space that everything is converging to. And when you don't have the connection, basically when your chemicals are actually being depressed, what ends up happening is everything becomes dulled. It could be your emotions, you lose your creativity, you lose your vigor, you lose your energy, and ultimately you have a distance from where you were naturally in equilibrium, and that distance is proportional to basically what you used to feel like. That's why it facilitates addictions. Anytime you have an addiction, essentially you reach a higher level, or you're reaching a peak, or you're tending towards that. For instance, like you consume alcohol. Okay, someone who's naturally anxious may consume alcohol to kind of depress their anxiety. And anxiety can have an amplifying effect, but anytime you depress this, it can kind of give you an elevation, or it can kind of, to an extent, there's multiple different scenarios, but anyway, like people who do drugs and like alcohol, it essentially causes a spike in neurotransmitter output. And then it tends to be a temporary spike, but it gives you a boost, and you reach a new peak. And once you reach this peak, the body starts actually building tolerance. Why? Because it wants to get back to this equilibrium level. So you go towards the peak, and then you come back down, and a lot of times you dip below equilibrium, so then you have to recharge depending on how much you drank. Like if you have a hangover, you're going to be in a lower state, maybe irritable, and then you're going to go back up to equilibrium, and then, you're feeling good, and then you repeat the cycle, but now you don't dip, now you don't reach the peak. You could say like a limit if you consume the same quantity, because now you're building tolerance, because your body's trying to depress it back to equilibrium, but then you have to consume more just to get past that, and it facilitates addiction. And the problem now is you keep going up, you keep going back down to equilibrium, you keep going up, you keep dipping down. Now the problem here is when you drink too much alcohol, you're causing a lot of inflammation. You're breaking the connection between neurotransmitters over time. So therefore, they can't communicate. They can't create that synchrony, the musical, the beats. It's kind of analogous to music. You have beats and everything's in synchrony. And when you have music, you get a feeling. And music creates that. You could create a euphoric effect. It affects your neurotransmitters in certain ways, and ultimately, whatever's happening internally is expressed externally. And but when you lose this connection or the communication, you're eventually tending towards dysphoria. And dysphoria is opposite of euphoria. So ultimately, you may have the output, but you're not, because it's kind of like diabetes. For instance, like when you have diabetes, you go through a pre-diabetic state before you go into diabetes. Pre-diabetic, all it is your insulin still works, but it's kind of going in overdrive. So what ends up happening, you drink, let's say you have a lot of sugar. Your blood sugar is going to spike, but it's going to dip. So you're going to have all these these very quick moving cycles or waves that are, and what happens is you lose a lot of energy, because when you go higher, because you're going at a higher peak, your body's going in overdrive to try to get it back down, but it drops very low, and because of that distance, that's proportional to the amount of energy that is yielded to induce that chemical reaction, and ultimately that suppresses energy reserves of the body, and it creates fatigue and tired. And usually, like in the pre-diabetic stage, you may fall asleep after a heavy carbohydrate meal. That is one typical sign. It doesn't necessarily imply that you have it. It's just implying that your body, your sugar, your insulin is becoming kind of resistant, and it's not able to derive that energy from the carbohydrate source, and so the energy can go into the cells. There's having a disconnect in that function, kind of like the disconnect in the neurotransmitter communication. Now you're having a disconnect with the receptor to insulin, and ultimately after pre-diabetic, you go to diabetes. Diabetes is a fixated, I wouldn't say fixated, but you reach you're constantly in a high zone until you take insulin to get back down to baseline or level that you need, and you have to take a certain amount just to figure out which level that your blood sugar should reside, and usually the doctors want you in the 90s to have a good energy level. But anyways, what I was saying is, like, what ends up with alcohol is kind of the opposite. Instead of like high blood sugar, well, not necessarily the opposite, but very similar. So you go through the phases when you get that boost, the euphoria, but now because of the inflammation, you're causing disconnect in your communication, you're breaking the transmission, and ultimately now you may consume the same output, and ultimately not only do you build tolerance, but because you disconnect the communication, because you break the receptivity, you're now going to need a lot more alcohol to get up there. But ultimately, when you're breaking the communication, you're not going to get the euphoric effect. It's ultimately, you're creating the imbalance in these chemicals, and when you create the imbalance, it can lead to irritability, dysphoria. And ultimately, you're getting to the point of singularity, because now life becomes ultimately meaningless, because everything becomes dull. You lose your creativity. You now realize the distance the point where you used to be, where you had the euphoria, and you're going so far away from that point, and now you realize you cannot reach that point unless ultimately you can't reach that point anymore. And so life, like all the processing, your perceptual range gets diminished. Everything becomes, like I said, it's low, and like you don't have that vigor, that drive, that energy, the motivation, the good feelings, the positivity that everyone else would share. And so you go to a point of singularity where everything kind of becomes negative, closed off. You're kind of like boxed, and you're not open to it, the expansion, because the universe, ultimately, the universe is expanding, and we, as humans, are guided. We should be guided in that direction. And that direction is, a state of higher consciousness. Love, for instance. Love is a state, generally the highest level of consciousness, when you feel you have the connection with the universe, you have the connection with people, the communion, and ultimately, why do you feel that connection? Because you're at a higher intensity. You have the vibration, you have the energy, you have the neurotransmitter. It's in a good balance, but a positive balance. You're in a positive region. So ultimately, you're experiencing more of the universe, the effect. Your perceptual range, your expands. So basically, like you go outside, everything's brighter, everything's more vivid, and you have that connection. So you're kind of in sync with the flow of life, and it just becomes very smooth and natural. And ultimately, this you realize your awareness expands, and you realize that we're all just share the same chemicals, the same experiences in different it's just programmed differently, but we're all ultimately part of the similar chemical arranged in different it's in a different arrangement, kind of like a recipe, but ultimately this is what kind of connects us, because we do different events. We basically all each have we each can gain that experience, that the cyclic processes of life, just the ups and downs, and we're all prone to this, we're all prone to different states, and we share, ultimately we all have the propensity to be in different levels. So like if anyone's, depressed, or anyone's down, if anyone just feels like life becomes meaningless, which, it's happened to me, multiple times, and this point, it's basically now I think of it like the body needs to recharge, because ultimately to sustain these states, and what I've learned is it's a lot about awareness. Expanding your awareness, your ultimately your consciousness, and by doing that you build resistance. You build resistance to ultimately the transience of life, because not only does you have an internal chemical balance that can cause problems, but the thing is why I want, it's good to be in balance, is because when you shift or alter, you become in a state of disequilibrium with these natural cycles. It can cause you a pulling force. You can get pulled down, or you can get pulled down due to maybe a breakup or relationship. There's different events that can have a transit, because normally you have your natural, like a move, like cycle, and then you have the external, which can have some influence. Usually that's more chaotic, and it's more day to day, because we can't predict everything. But ultimately we build resistance by just becoming open, and it kind of expanding and trying to gaining the insight that we all have moments that we suffer, and and that the key is we need to by coming together, and basically like for instance, when we share ideas, we're exponentially increasing the potential. So like when we actually at least give each other advice or insights, we're basically moving in a positive direction, and that's what we should try to reinforce, because ultimately it's easier to go down than it is to go up. So but the thing is you got to get to this experience, and then come to the realization that you have to, what you need to do to maintain the level. If you achieve balance, if you're exercising, if you're trying to achieve the equilibrium, you have the higher propensity to stay in the positive zone. You're not going to dip too low, or eventually have these temporary highs, these temporary shifts. I mean, they're good. We all shouldn't abuse it. It's okay to do these occasionally, but drinking, I'm not saying to give up that, but when you go towards the extremes, you're causing chaos, you're causing problems. So the key is just to balance everything. Naturally try to follow the cycle, the natural cycles, the light, the dark, the diurnal, the hunger cycle, you want to eat when you're hungry, not when you're full, and just balance these, create a smooth wave in these cycles, instead of like rapid spikes, which depress a lot of energy, and ultimately that can cause essentially the mood to be more in the equilibrium level. Or you can achieve higher states, because ultimately that is it's a proponent on the mindset. And the mindset, you drive energy. By being positive, you're driving more energy. When you always staying negative, you're tending towards singularity. You're tending towards that point, and that point is ultimately, it can take a long time when you get extremely low, and you're like stuck in this hole, you're stuck in this state of despair, you're stuck. It's like gravity is pulling down on you. You start becoming tired. You start sleeping more. It's like force pushing down on you, and you're not lifted. You're not liberated. You're not light. So positivity is ascension. You're ascending upward. You're becoming uplifted, however you want to view it. And you're expanding outward. You're looking globally versus inward toward how you naturally feel. So anyways, this is just my input on the matter, and I just believe, it's always good to just talk about random subjects, and I'm not always correct, but I just enjoy pondering and, just learning, and that, I think everyone's input perspective is important, and if we actually listen, if we focus on listening, it can be a huge beneficial proponent to, our future. So that's all I have.